Greetings, true believers. It is I, Mr. Asa, and I have returned to build on what we worked on last week of the creation of superheroes, and today create together super villains. Where would superheroes be without supervillains, yes? Okay, so what do we know about supervillains? Hang on, okay, that's a little better. What do we know about supervillains? Well, supervillains are usually sometimes more powerful than the superheroes, where a lot of the times the superheroes will need to work together to take on the supervillains, right? Avengers, Thanos, X-Men, Magneto, right? The entire Justice League just to take down Lex Luthor, who doesn't even really have powers except he's got his super brain. He's really smart. Oh yeah, and a billionaire. Watch out for those people. So usually very, very powerful. Very, very smart. Okay? So, you got your papers out? You got your pens? Start writing these things. Brilliant. Rich, maybe? Very powerful. So let's think of some villains that we know of. I just said Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor. He, like, grew up with Superman, right? Hates Superman. Hates him. We have to give these guys motivation. Why are they villains? Why are they bad? Hate Superman. Why? He's basically jealous. He's basically jealous of Superman. He resents him because Superman was just born with all these powers, and Lex Luthor is bald and also envious of Superman's hair, first of all, but also resents, he thinks that Superman just had it easy, just be born with all these powers, and Lex Luthor had a pretty, his dad was not the easiest. Lex Luthor Sr., he was pretty mean and cruel, you know, so he had to prove himself. He really had to prove himself, and he was taking out a lot of that out on Superman. What are some other villains along those lines? Also, Lex Luthor is insanely smart. He's insanely smart. He's so brilliant. He creates, like Iron Man level smart, like Tony Stark, where he can just, like, make all this armor, all these suits, all these enhancements, rocket ships, time travel, whatever. He figures it all out. Otherwise, how could a guy who doesn't have any superpowers be, like, this huge villain that, like, takes down the Flash and Wonder Woman and Superman and Batman, right? So what's a similar one? In the Marvel Universe, Doctor Doom, who rules with an iron fist, literally, right? So Doctor Doom, he's like one of the Fantastic Four villains. Also, really smart. Really resentful, again, of his old ex-best friend from college, Mr. Fantastic, the stretchy guy, the leader of the Fantastic Four. We talked about them a little bit last week. Dr. Doom, just like how the Fantastic Four got their powers from an accident in space where the cosmic rays just, like, bombarded them, and they all started turning into very poetic versions of themselves, like the Thing, who had body issues about himself, then became the Thing. Ben Grimm became the Thing, who then, all of their fears are basically kind of like amplified. Invisible Woman, who, she was a woman in, like, the 1960s. Like, she was not, people weren't paying attention to her. It was really, like, kind of a much more, not cool time, in the world for women, especially. And so she became the Invisible Woman. Johnny Storm, who was he was a teenager, hot-headed and fiery, Johnny Storm, Invisible Woman's brother, Human Torch, right? These are, like, easy to kind of imagine where their powers come from. And Mr. Fantastic, very stretchy, very flexible. He can always wrap his mind around any problem, right? So, stretchy powers, okay? Dr. Doom, who was like lab buddies and like best friends with Mr. Fantastic in college, maybe grad school, when they were doing an experiment, like it blew up in Dr. Doom's face. And now he's ugly, buggly, like really, I mean, let's not say ugly, he's very scarred. And his face looks melted, you know? He's like, don't look at me. And I think he's very resentful of Mr. Fantastic, of Reed Richards, his real name, Mr. Fantastic, of his, that he still has his, handsome face, and he got these powers and everything, whereas Dr. Doom, he wasn't looking so good on his Tinder profiles no more, so he made the mask, he hid, so he was like, that's a metaphor for like how kind of rotten he is on the inside, is that he has this deformity now. And so he used his brilliance to create this armor everywhere to hide himself. And it's like full of gadgets, and he can fly with it, and it gives him super strength. It's sort of like an Iron Man type deal with his armor. And he's also the king of Latvia, which is an Eastern European country. So he builds like robot armies and stuff. So he's a pretty powerful force to be reckoned with. Again, even though he doesn't have actual superpowers. Okay? What's another villain we can think about? Maybe a little bit different than these Lex Luthor, brilliant scientist, no powers, but has a chip on their shoulder type. The Joker, right? The Joker. That's the Batman villain, and his whole thing, like, he didn't have an easy life. He was, there's different versions of his backstory, but in the one that I like, and there was a movie that came out recently that was good, that don't watch until you're older than probably you are right now. But as we can see from the animated series from the 90s, which was so good, or the comics or whatever, he's insane. He's like super sane. He's like a different kind of sanity that's not healthy, however you slice it. And he had a really hard time growing up. He was a failed comedian, a failed thief, like all of these things that didn't work out for him. He had a breakdown. And his whole deal is that he believes that everyone is just one bad day away from being the clown, from being like him. And he has a lot of really good points, because who is his hero? Who is the guy that fights him? It's Batman. Batman is he's crazy. He's crazy. He's a billionaire who had a very traumatic event in his childhood. Remember, his parents in the alley, they were killed. He witnessed the whole thing as a child. And he never forgot. And he never really processed that in a very healthy way where he could, like, move on or, like, honor them, but, like, move on with his own life. He decided to use his billions of dollars to invent a bunch of bat-themed gadgets and dress up like a bat himself and study karate and build bat-themed helicopters and cars and go out against the law, like not as a police officer or anything, and go like beat people up that he thought were bad. And so Joker's like, I look crazy, Batman, but you also look crazy. And just because Batman is on kind of the other side, where he is, fighting people that are committing crimes, from a sanity perspective, they're kind of in the same boat. Although Batman doesn't kill people and the Joker does kill people. So we have insanity. We have craziness is a motivation for villains. Because some people, they feel a certain way. They feel not good, you know? They had a bad childhood, they had a bad whatever, they had a bad breakup, they lost their job, a million things can happen to someone, and that can tip them over the edge and drive them to the dark side of the Force, right? Speaking of the dark side of the Force, we have Darth Vader. It's not a comic book character per se, although there's plenty of Star Wars comic books, but it comes from the movie, right? And these movies are based on all the myths. It's just basically like the stories of Hercules or, you know, Buddha, if you're thinking about Yoda, or Luke Skywalker is like kind of like this biblical like Messiah character too. You know, it's like the Bible. It's like all the stories are all very similar once we think about it. Once we really know how to look at all of our stories. Excuse me. And so Darth Vader, right? Anakin. If you watch, like, there was the first 3 Star Wars movies that came out in the 70s, and then there was the next 3 that came out in like the late 90s, 2000s. And so Anakin Skywalker, we get to see his childhood and his upbringing, his adolescence before he was Darth Vader. And so we can see something that's very classic, which is he had a rough childhood. In his case, he had his mother, his saint of a mother, you know, no father. Sort of like this immaculate conception thing there. But he idolized his mother. His mother sacrificed so much for him. And then I think it was the Jawas or something. Those people who live in the sand. I think they killed his mom, right? And he lost it. He was also more powerful than anybody already. He was like the chosen one. He was supposed to balance out the Force. Because even as a small child, he had more force powers than any, like even Yoda, even Master Yoda. But that's too much. He didn't get his Jedi training until later. Like usually you're supposed to start when you're like, 5. He was like, I don't know, 8 or 9. So he didn't really know how to handle this for a long time. And when he saw that his mother was dead, he freaked out. And he killed all of those people that he perceived as evil. He slaughtered them. And then the dark side of the Force got into him, and then he was manipulated by that and by the Emperor. And then he went out and he slayed all of the Jedis except for Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, pretty much. It's horrifying. So childhood has a lot to do with becoming a hero or a villain. I had another student in one of my other classes, and he was developing a villain. He developed 2 different villains, and it's like, so what was his motivation? Why did he become a villain? And his answer, which I thought was very, very apt, he was probably in 4th grade. His answer that he responded with was that because he didn't get enough love as a child, right? When we don't, no matter who you are, no matter who we are, if we don't get enough love, sometimes, because we need that. We need that to live. We need that to be. We need that to be full and whole. Sometimes people, if they don't get enough love, they will have to take it. They will feel that they have to take it because it's not coming freely, And that's sad, and that is how, you know, the kind of that negativity will perpetuate itself. Also, if something actually, if there's a trauma, like a traumatic, like a negative experience when we're young, sometimes the way that that gets processed out by in a child or a person who's growing up, is that then they take that trauma that happened to them, and then when they're an adult, they do the same thing to someone else. So if a child is like abused as a child, sometimes they go on, if they haven't, if they're not guided or have like the strength or, you know, healing power within themselves, they can actually go on to abuse others. This is a root of a lot of villains. Carnage from Spider-Man is a really good example. Google him, but not too much. He's sort of like a Joker character who wants to watch the world burn because their own lives were not easy. Carnage he was a total insane psychopath who shared a prison cell with Eddie Brock, who was Venom. Venom from Spider-Man, like Spider-Man's #1 villain. And the Venom symbiote, the Venom costume was actually alive, right? You remember? And it would go, this black goo. It had its own mind, its own consciousness that would drive someone who was already kind of crazy over the edge and fill them with bloodlust. And Eddie Brock, the guy who wore the Venom costume, he didn't like Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, because Peter Parker like stole his job or something like that. They both worked at the newspaper. Something like that. Whatever. Go look it up. But it's something like that. And the costume, the Venom symbiote itself, also didn't like Peter Parker, Spider-Man, because at first it found Peter Parker and it loved his spider powers, but then Spider-Man, Peter Parker, rejected it. He's like, dude, you're crazy. I liked this cool black costume at first, but then it started whispering in my ear, and I don't need that. I don't got time for that. So he like the costume is vulnerable to sound waves, so he basically like hugged a giant church bell until the costume was like, and just like crawled away. Until it found Eddie Brock, and they both hated Spider-Man, so that was a good villain combination, right? So Eddie Brock's motivation was kind of revenge, because he blamed Peter Parker for him losing his job. I think his girlfriend too. Like, his life just collapsed because Peter Parker like did something with the newspaper that was the right thing to do, but Eddie Brock didn't see it like that. And the costume also hated Peter Parker because he felt rejected and wanted revenge. So we're dealing with a lot of things. We're talking about the motivation of a villain. So a lot of times it has to do with childhood trauma, you know, neglect, resentment, revenge, envy. All of these things can turn someone into can bring someone to the dark side of the force, right? You know, sometimes there's people that are bad just out of like necessity, you know, like having to steal from a bread truck because your family is starving. So there are villains who you know, are just like thieves that need to that feel like they need to do this. You know, like Catwoman, she would steal, but she would like steal and then like donate that stuff to like cat charities. Like, she liked cats more than people, you know. So sometimes, you know, pretty much all the time, but I mean, there's some, I'm sorry, hang on. There's some villains that totally love being evil and know that they're evil and like have evil laughs and everything like that. But most villains actually think that they are good, that they're the hero. I can think of some in real life, actually, that are really kind of evil, maniacal megalomaniacs that think that they're good guys, even in the real world. Maybe you can think of some of these people. But that's why these characters are so complicated and rich and dense. Like, for the X-Men, there's Magneto, right? And the X-Men mythology is great because their powers come from them being mutants, right? They're born with these powers. They can't change the way that they are. But they live in a world that fears and hates them, right? Just because of how they were born. You know, they call them mutie, or if you're friends with them, they call you a mutie lover. Like this, okay? This is a metaphor for our world, our life, because there really are people that will resent, hate, or fear other people just because of how they were born, right? So Professor X, the leader of the X-Men, he believed that humans and mutants could live together in peace, you know? He wanted civil rights for mutants. And he really believed that through compassion and demonstrating good work and protecting each other and looking out for each other, that humans and mutants could live together. I also believe that. But his ex-best friend, just like Mr. Fantastic and Dr. Doom, his ex-best friend, Eric Magnus Leshner, a.k.a. Magneto, had a different philosophy. Because they also like went to college together. They were like young men, like on the front lines of like the mutant rights movement. But Magneto, as a very, very small child, was a survivor of the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust was a time when in Germany there were these people, these villains, this army of villains called the Nazis, actually went around and exterminated brutally in real life, in this world, in World War II, millions upon millions of people, just because of how they were born. Magneto, as a small child, he was a survivor of this, but his whole family didn't make it. They were exterminated. And he watched this happen, and he always believed that this could happen again, that humans were not to be trusted because of what he experienced when he was young, right? So he believed in mutant supremacy. He thought that mutants should rule. There's Homo sapiens, humans, Homo superior, mutants. That's how he saw everything, was that the mutants were superior and that mutants should be in charge and maybe even like straight up exterminate the humans, because he was really, really mad. He was very angry, very mad, and very powerful. He could control metal. He was the master of magnetism. So if you had, like I broke my leg and I have a metal, my shin bone, my tibia is made, or maybe my fibula, is made out of titanium now. Because I broke my leg, so they put a whole metal rod in my leg. If Magneto didn't like me and wanted to teach me a lesson or really mess me up, he could just go whoop and just suck this metal rod right out of my leg. He can lift up a stadium made out of metal. He can like destroy a building. He can like just go like this, whoosh, throw a car at you, that's a huge power. It's a huge superpower, very powerful. So it really always takes the entirety of the X-Men to stop him. Or just Professor X, because Professor X is very powerful, and one time he did totally stop Magneto in his tracks, and that had dire consequences for the Marvel Universe. But that's a story for another day, when Professor X actually became a villain called Onslaught. I'll tell you that some other time. Anyway, so Magneto, he believed that mutants should rule the world. He had his own team, too, called the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. That was, like, the name of it in, like, the 60s. Because he didn't see himself as evil. But, like, when in the 60s, when everyone was, like, so dramatic and, like, had all this flair, like, that's what they were called. The members of it was the Toad. Toad was one, and he had toad powers and, like, a gross tongue that would, like steal your sword right out of your hand. Jumping powers, and he was really slimy. And the Blob, he was like huge and could really throw his weight around. He was unmovable, and he had like, he wasn't as strong as the Hulk, but he was really strong. I don't know, sometimes Juggernaut would be on that team. Some of these guys were admittedly pretty evil because they didn't have as much of a philosophy as Magneto. They mainly just wanted to watch the world burn and maybe steal stuff and be rich. In any case, Magneto, very complicated character. Again, that has to do with childhood trauma, and like a philosophy that goes along with his, his actions, everything that he does. Yeah, I mean, there's Gorilla Grodd, the Flash villain, who's a gorilla with psychic abilities, who basically wants to destroy all humans, because humans are destroying the environment. So that's a good motivation too. A lot of these villains consider themselves just to be radical, like zealots, like revolutionaries that use force to enact this change that they want to see. Whereas the best heroes, whether it be Yoda or Professor X, or whoever, wants peace. Even Buddha, even in the Bible, all of these characters from all of our stories, Hercules, want just peace. And, in the comic books and in the movies, use violence sometimes to, as a last resort, but, really not trying to go there at first, right? Trying to be diplomatic and come to a way that we can all get along without, having to kill each other. But obviously in comics, it's more fun to read a comic book with explosions and eye laser beams that can set your hair on fire and stuff like that. So we can have fun with all of those things. So think about the background of your villain. Why are they evil? Why did they get like this? What is their connection to the heroes? Because oftentimes it is your best friend that will turn out to be your worst enemy. Like you don't really get arch nemesis in the world unless you actually loved them or cared about them a lot at first, right? Because you can't betray someone who doesn't even give a hoot about you. You have to give a hoot in order for them to be able to betray you, right? So what is their connection to the hero? Write these things down. What happened to them to make them evil? What is their connection to the hero? What went wrong there? What are their powers? How did they get their powers? Is it a metaphor for who they are inside? Like how Dr. Doom, he got his face disfigured. It's a metaphor for like his heart, Lex Luthor is just smart, he got his powers from birth and also being like brought up a billionaire and everything like that. Who else? Joker doesn't really have powers, but he did also get disfigured. I mean, there's lots of different stories about the Joker. Sometimes he just wears makeup. Sometimes he did fall into a vat of acid and it turned his face white and gave him clown-like features, and now he can't stop laughing because he's like, you know, the acid also did something to his brain, even though he was already on his way to being a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Who else did we say? Magneto, he's just a mutant. He was born that way. Anyway, just think about all of these things. And then, like, what do they look like? Their costumes. Can you make a group of villains? Like, for Spider-Man, sometimes his villains would get together, and they would be called the Sinister Six. All right? They always have fun names like that, you know? Suicide Squad. Right? A lot of alliteration, like the Suicide Squad. Sinister Six. Ooh, yeah, a lot of S's going on there. Yeah, so maybe you throw some of these guys together that have a common cause to do something. I mean, there's so many things you can draw from that's happening in the world right now. A lot of players are on the map. A lot of things are on the table. Stakes are high, right? So where do the heroes come in? Where do the villains come in? What is their end game here? Okay? So, yeah. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on and on about other villains. Like I love Swamp Thing. And then there's the Swamp Thing villains like Anton Arcane or the Fluorescent Man or whatever. Who are like, because Swamp Thing, he's made out of plants. And so his enemies are people who pollute, right? Same thing with Captain Planet and like all of like the corporation polluters and everything like that. I love that stuff. You know, there's so many good villains everywhere, right? Because that's our shadows. That is our shadow selves. We are the villains. That we're capable of both of those things. We're capable of the light and the dark, but we are Jedis, right? We fight for the light together. We are gardeners of the light, okay? And our shadows, we don't push away. We accept them and we bring them into ourselves, okay? We are not just one thing. We are like a yin and a yang. We are the light and the dark put together. And in our stories, that is what is represented. That is what the heroes and the villains reflect of us. Okay? So think about your dark side. What does that look like? Better out than in, right? Explore your dark side and really get it out there. And then we can all process and be even stronger for that. Okay? I wish I could see all of your amazing characters. This is so good. But you know what? I will, once your Netflix show or your Marvel movie gets picked up, please just like tag me in that so that I know that we worked on this together. Okay? You don't gotta like, I don't need to make any of the millions of dollars that you will sell your characters for eventually. But I would love a shout out. Okay? All right. Anyway, well, get to it. And I will see you guys again. Same bat time, same bat channel. Excelsior. Nuff said. Mwah.